Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's event. I'd just like to let you know that we have our keynote speaker coming over from one of the intergovernmental sessions that's just wrapping up. So we're going to give him an extra 2 minutes and then we'll start the meeting.
You can come here. Daniel, just for you to know that the meeting just finished now, so give them a little bit of time to connect into something else because we started very late this morning, as you could see, so they just continued until now.
Okay, thank you very much, Paola. Yes, so colleagues, we have a number of participants who will be joining from the intergovernmental sessions along with our speakers, so we'll give them a couple of minutes to connect to the meeting and then we'll begin shortly. Welcome once again, everyone, to today's event on urban and peri-urban forest ecosystems for green recovery. We're delighted to welcome you to our event today. As the participants from the intergovernmental session are connecting, I'll just begin with some quick housekeeping. First, to let you know, today's event is being recorded, so please be aware of that. Now, I'll go through quickly the agenda before introducing our moderator to introduce the opening speaker today. So we will have, after our opening address, we'll have a keynote presentation by Dr. Cecil Groenendijk, who is the author of the excellent policy brief that he'll present today. This is a draft policy brief, so we're hoping today's discussion will help inform the finalization of the brief. This will be followed by a panel discussion, and we have a really rich slate of panelists today, concluding then with a question and answer. And so for participants, if you have questions on the keynote presentation or on the panel discussion, we invite you to share them in the meeting chat, and we will address these together during the question and answer session. So we won't have a Q&A after the keynote. We'll go straight into the panel, and then we'll move into the question and answer session before closing the meeting. Today's event has interpretation in English or Russian, so please select your preferred interpretation language on the bottom left hand of your screen. As I mentioned, please share chats on the presentation or panel discussion, questions on the panel discussion or presentation in the meeting chat. We'll address these during the question and answer. Panelists can request the floor to turn on their microphone and video. So with that, I would like to, welcome our moderators for today's event. We have dual moderators who are working together from the Federal Office for the Environment of Switzerland. We have Ms. Clémence Dirac, co-host of the Forest Ecosystem Service and Silviculture section, and Mr. Keith Anderson, Senior Advisor for International Forest Policy. So welcome to you both. We'll have Ms. Clémence Dirac moderating the first half of the meeting, followed by Mr. Keith Anderson in the second half. So Clémence, I'd like to welcome you to the floor without further ado. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for giving me the floor. I'm very happy to be with you today again, moderating this side event on urban forestry. As Daniel says, I'm working for the Swiss government in the forest division. So in our division, we usually work under the Swiss forest law. So we usually worked on forest ground issues. But however, we are seeing that there is more and more the need to go across the border of the forest and to work with partner and with other sector as the forest sector. For example, the urban sector, or for example, the agroforestry sector. That's why we are supporting actually and participating to this current and important interdisciplinary and intersectoral trends. We are supporting some national initiative or project on urban or agroforestry. We are also supporting some international initiative, for example, this UN ECE project on urban forestry. That's why I'm very happy to be with you today and to moderate this event. I would like to welcome Mrs. Paula Deda, the Director of Forest Land and Housing Division of UNECE, to give some opening remarks. Please, Paula, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And actually, good morning or good afternoon to everybody from Rome. I'm here for the joint session of COFI and EFC. And actually, happy celebration of Foresta, the European Forest Week at Foresta 2021. Let me start by actually thanking our Swiss government. And actually, I'm here in the room with Keith that is trying to connect. So in case you see me disappearing, he will appear on this very same screen. Thanks Switzerland and our colleagues for the support they're given to this work, which to us is extremely important. Also, a special thanks to Dr. Cecil Konendijk, sorry if the pronunciation is not correct, for the draft policy brief. I'm really happy we're tabling it today, and then we'll be able to finalize it through the input that we received today. Let me also, before I get to the substance of today's meeting, remind you that there will be another meeting of the informal network of experts on sustainable urban forestry in the second week of December. That's very important because this informal network is a product of our discussions and our work on urban forestry, and it's very important for sharing experience and also for capacity building throughout the region. Now, I think it's crucial to talk about urban forestry. It's something that is perceived as an extremely important and urgent matter, not only from the forestry side, but in particular from the urban side, from cities. And let me tell you this, as you know, my division covers the work of two committees, one on forests that you know very well and you are part of it, and one also on urban development, housing and land management. And it's really there where expertise is also necessary and needed. As cities are looking more and more into nature-based solutions that will allow cities to face, in particular, the challenges posed by climate change. This really means greening the city, but also looking at solutions that will allow avoiding natural disasters such as floods that have proven to be related also to the fact that the built environment is covering natural soils and there is no permeability of soils, and we're also missing biodiversity, but also natural infrastructure in cities. We thought, okay, well, when we were working with cities, that the expertise is there. After all, we had landscape architects working for a very long time with cities. The reality is that urban forestry expertise is missing, and cities are not knowledgeable, or at least not all cities are knowledgeable on how to do that, how to undertake this new road of nature-based solutions, starting from understanding what is a nature-based solution, how do we do this, and how it's different from cities to city, because of course every urban environment is different, not only in the urban infrastructure, but also in the local biodiversity the area where the city is located. So we really welcome very much this event today, also as a bridge to the work of the Auto Committee, where urbanists and architects are representing member states as well as cities and mayors. And we hope to bridge this also to the Forum of Mayors that will take place in April 2022 in Geneva, where an entire session would really be dedicated to nature-based solutions in cities. So let's really share this expertise across the border, as it was just said, to make sure that we prepare ourselves for a future where nature will have to be more and more part of our urban environments, really to face climate change, but also it's not only for that, it's also for the preservation and conservation of biodiversity, as well as for the well-being of citizens. So I stop here. I might share my computer soon if Keith is not going to join from his computer, but I wish you success. You're in, great. So I wish you a successful meeting, and I hope to see you, all of you, in person for another of these events, perhaps very shortly, if not in Rome, certainly in Geneva. So back to you, Ceci. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula Deda, for these introducing remarks. So we will speak today about the policy brief on advancing sustainable urban and peri-urban forestry, a green approach to resilience, health, and green recovery. As said, this policy brief was written by Cecile Konendik. Cecile is widely regarded as one of the world's leading scholars in the field of urban forestry. He is a professor and program director at the Faculty of Forestry in the University of British Columbia. In addition, he co-leads from his current home city in Barcelona, the Nature-Based Solution Institute, which is a think tank and advisory organization. Cecile has advised international organizations like UN and European Union, as well as national and local governments in over 30 countries on urban forestry strategy and programs. So we thank you, Cecile, for having write these policy briefs for us. Please note that the policy briefs will be finalized after today's event, taking into consideration the panel discussion and the question and answer session. So now I would like to invite Cecile to make the presentation of the policy brief. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clémence, and thank you also, Paula, for introducing this session. It has been my great pleasure to work together with the excellent team at UNECE, formulating this policy brief really as an important step in this journey that urban and peri-urban forestry has been taking. And as we know, of course, the impact of trees in cities, and nature in cities, forest in cities has become more and more clear, and I think also more and more understood for its importance. So I think it's a really good time to look at developing further policy recommendations. So just a little bit of background. So there is, as I mentioned, an increasing focus on urban and peri-urban forestry. For example, as part of climate action, just a little example here on the right from the United States, where a new report came out that really helped promote the role of urban forest in dealing with extreme weather events and providing cooler places in cities, especially to vulnerable communities. Just another example, the infrastructure bill in the United States that is currently in the process of being adopted, which would actually allocate substantial funding to green infrastructure, including urban forests. So UNECE, of course, has really been interested also in expanding its activities more towards urban and peri-urban forestry. And one of the important activities that UNECE does is to provide policy guidance. So this policy brief has really been drafted to support urban and peri-urban forestry programs across the UNECE region, which includes Europe, North America, as well as Central Asian countries, and to really also help foster a culture of exchanging knowledge and good practice. So just to show you the urban forest, this is my former home city of Vancouver, British Columbia, also part of the UNECE region. And this picture really shows kind of the essence of what urban forestry, peri-urban forestry is all about. So it's about all the trees, all the forest in the city, around the city, and seeing that as a system, as a socio-ecological system that provides a wide range of benefits to the people living in these cities. But of course, it has a lot of different components, right? It ranges from forest ecosystems, the city forests of Europe, the Stadtwald in Germany, for example, in Switzerland, to street trees, to individual trees like this beautiful London plane tree here in Amsterdam, to, of course, highly designed urban parks like Park Güell here in Barcelona. So first, some of the key messages from the policy brief. And I said, this is a draft document where we're really eager to finalize based on some of your suggestions and comments. First of all, of course, it does state the contributions, the essential contributions of forest trees and associated vegetation. For example, to climate change adaptation and mitigation, as critical infrastructure to deal with disaster risk reduction, public health and well-being, biodiversity conservation, as well as sustainable economic recovery and growth. So it is an integrative and strategic nature-based solution, this idea of sustainable urban and peri-urban forestry. And you see here we've added the word sustainable to really focus, or shift the focus maybe a little bit from just the tree planting side of it, we need more trees, but really to show we have to think longer term. These trees that are planted only make sense if there is a sustainable long-term management in place that also involves good community stewardship. So we need that long-term management perspective. And here, of course, the forestry sector has a lot of experience with kind of 50 years, 100 years longer time perspectives that are really also desperately needed in our cities, where these cycles are often very quick. We know political cycles can be 4 years long, for example, which doesn't really compare very well with tree time. But tree time could be 100 years or longer. And this now will require some really well-integrated programs, master plans to guide sustainable management. So afforestation and tree planting are fantastic, but they should always be followed up by a very clear sustainable long-term management perspective. And this, of course, also includes strong assessment and monitoring components that really identify how the urban forest is developing, how the benefits it provides are developing, and also how the interactions between trees and people are developing over time to measure success and to measure performance. We will need to build strong collaboration, partnerships, and stewardship, as well as develop peer learning and networking. As Clément says, the Swiss government has been really generous in supporting some of these initiatives, realizing, of course, that we all are in this together. We really have to learn from each other's experiences and knowledge and share the rapidly growing knowledge base and evidence base within urban and peri-urban forestry. And also ideas like benchmarking could come in here. The scope of the brief really focuses, first of all, on urbanization challenges, what urban areas today are challenged with, for example, in terms of, air pollution, health challenges, climate change, and the like. And of course, it depends a bit where you are in the UNECE region to compare the severity of these challenges. There is a global attention for urban green space, and that is reflected in some of the policies like the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Decade of Restoration, which has an urban component, and another wide range of policies and initiatives. And urban and peri-urban forestry is not the only concept that is playing in here. We are all familiar with terms like nature-based solutions, urban greening, green infrastructure. But there's something special, I would argue, about the role of trees and forest in this picture. And that's why we want to really push that concept or promote that idea of sustainable urban and peri-urban forestry as part of the greening of cities. And it's good to see that organizations like UNECE, FAO, and others are really more and more involved in urban and peri-urban forestry as well. So what do we know about urban and peri-urban forests today? Well, very little, honestly, at the national level. Only very few countries have done national assessments of their urban and peri-urban forest resource. And one of the maybe best examples is the United States. But cities are increasingly trying to get a good grasp of their urban forest resource. And that's not always easy because, for example, the private part of the urban forest, or the privately owned component, is not always so easy to assess. It's often focused on street trees and publicly owned woodland. But new geospatial tools actually give us more opportunities to get a better overview. Woodland forest ecosystems are important components, and they provide a range of very specific benefits like recreation, but urban forests do come in many forms and shapes. And there's a lot of focus on what we call canopy cover assessments and targets. So cities often say, well, we want to have a 20 or 30 or 40% canopy cover, because we know that canopy cover can be related to, for example, climate adaptation, cooling benefits, air pollution reduction benefits. So just to show you what cities are doing, this is my current home city of Barcelona. I developed this really excellent document called Trees for Life, the master plan for Barcelona's trees. And you see here things like every citizen in Barcelona has one tree at their availability, and 1 out of 5 of those, 20%, is actually managed by the city. You see also the type of division of ownership, etc. It's often a very complex situation. So we launched this idea set of sustainable urban and peri-urban forestry. And people will say, well, do we need another concept, another term? It's not really another term. It's just an add-on to this well-established concept of urban and peri-urban forestry. But we really want to shift the focus more towards a sustainable long-term management perspective to be sure to ensure that we provide those benefits that urban forests do provide on the longer term. And to have a sustainable urban forestry approach, urban forestry needs to be integrative. So it needs to go across disciplines, across types of tree resources. It needs to be strategic, long-term, with long-term visions and objectives. It needs to be interdisciplinary, so it is the work not only of foresters, but also of landscape designers, urban planners, social scientists, ecologists, and the like. It's also inclusive, so it should really involve local residents, local communities, to ensure proper stewardship of the resource. And finally, and it seems obvious, right, but it's also urban. So it means that we have to realize we're operating in urban contexts that are highly complex and often not very favorable for the growing of trees. So that's really something that poses an extra challenge to the management. The potential of urban forestry, though, or urban and peri-urban forestry, is really large. Climate change adaptation and mitigation, trees can play a huge role. Mitigation by storing carbon, reducing energy costs, but also adapting cities to, for example, extreme weather events, cooling down urban heat islands. And here really the term critical infrastructure comes in. So urban and peri-urban forests are part of what we call critical infrastructure, the assets that cities need to survive also during times of disasters. Of course, we know that trees improve our health and well-being. They help conserve biodiversity and contribute to ecosystem restoration and keep people, including our children, in contact with nature. And they also can contribute significantly, actually, to green economies and recovery. And that could be something that comes in handy after our COVID-19 pandemic. I just wanted to show two studies that just give you a little bit of flavor of the immense importance of urban and peri-urban forests. IS Global, an organization here in Barcelona, recently did a ranking of 1,000 European cities and concluded that more than 60% of people in Europe live in areas where there's not sufficient green space according to WHO standards. And increasing greenness would actually be able to prevent up to 43,000 deaths per year in European cities. And then a study by the Arbor Day Foundation and the University of Nebraska in the United States found that the urban forestry activities in the US have a value, an economic value of $64 billion through employment, to the so-called multiplier effect. And actually more than 500,000 people in the US are directly employed in the urban forestry sector, primarily through design and maintenance companies. So how can we enhance the impact of urban forests? Well, first of all, of course, and this is really key, we have to make sure that these benefits of urban and peri-urban forests are delivered to people's doorsteps. And I mean literally to people's doorsteps. So everybody should have direct access to urban forests. Seeing a tree, having a tree on your street, having a tree in your garden, meeting other people in your neighborhood under tree canopy. But that, of course, also means that we have to think about diversity and resilience. So these urban forests are not too prone to climate change impacts or the impact of pests and diseases. As said, and I'm repeating this like a mantra, planting of trees is great, is good. Sustainable management of these to provide long-term benefits. That's really what we have to be better. And that also includes then the stewardship together with local communities to make sure there's a really strong connection between the local community and the management of the resource. That also requires dedicated strategies and plans like urban forest master plans. And cities like, for example, Birmingham, that we'll hear later on the panel, have actually gone down the road of developing a very long-term vision of its urban forest. Of course, when we do this, we need to be well informed. We need to have a good evidence base to reflect good practice. And we need to track and demonstrate success. And actually a really interesting part, I think, for the forestry sector is that sustainable urban and peri-urban forestry can be a bridge that strengthens the urban-rural interface. These areas have often been pretty much separated, the urban and the rural, but of course these two are really in need of much more integration and coordination in terms of planning and policy and management. Of course, that also requires in general partnerships and collaboration. And we see also a need to further the business case for urban and peri-urban forestry. And these figures that I just showed you, for example, from the US, they're really powerful to show the impact, also the economic impact and the economic importance of urban and peri-urban forestry. So moving towards the final part of this brief introduction of the policy brief, you'll see that the brief ends with a call for action. And this is, of course, from the UNECE standpoint, but actually it is really from the urban forestry sector standpoint as well. So one of the opportunities we see is an implementation of global goals and policies through sustainable urban and peri-urban forestry. SUPF is really a delivery mechanism for things like the Sustainable Development Goals, but actually a whole range of other policies by UNECE, but also by other organizations. We need to coordinate with other sectors and policies, obviously. We heard already, for example, urban policy, housing sector, economics, but also, for example, the public health sector. We need to be better also in strengthening the opportunities we can find by getting different levels of government, different levels of authorities to collaborate. The local level has, of course, often been driving urban forestry forward, which makes sense. But there's really a role also for national and regional authorities to guide, to provide funding, to provide support, as well as maybe guidelines for urban forestry. Of course, you want to learn from good examples and good practices. And fortunately, we have a whole range, a whole suite of good cases now that we can build on. And that can really then also be used to foster a culture of regional and cross-boundary collaboration, because as I said, the challenges we see in urban and peri-urban forestry are actually not unique often to specific contexts. There's a lot of them that will go across. This gives us an opportunity to monitor and benchmark across the region, promote the use of international standards and guidelines that we see more and more now, including the FAO guidelines for urban and peri-urban forestry, as well as to promote greater awareness still of the importance of urban and peri-urban forests. So just one example of a guideline, something that we actually have written into the policy brief, is the idea of the 330-300 rule. And this is really a guideline, a recommendation that can bring these trees into people's very daily life, where you're working, where you're learning, where you're playing in the city. It basically says that to promote the health benefits and the climate adaptation benefits of urban forests, we need to make sure that every citizen in the UNECE region should be able to see at least 3 trees from their window, the visible green, the proximity of green. Everybody should also live in a neighborhood that has at least 30% canopy cover. And 30% has been found to be an important cutoff point where the mental health benefits and also the cooling benefits really start kicking in. And then finally, and this is not new because we know this from WHO guidance as well, everybody should have easy access to public green space within a 300-meter distance from your home, not more than a 5-minute walk. So 330-300 is one of those opportunities, guidances that can really elevate the importance of urban forestry. And it's an easy to understand rule that decision makers, policy makers could implement. And it's also based on a pretty strong evidence base. So I thank you very much for listening to you. And I know that we will have an interesting panel discussion after this. So I didn't want to take too much time, and I invite you all to be part of this process as we are going to implement policy brief and implement many of the ideas in it, for example, through a new global expert of a network of experts over the next years. I thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Cecile, for your presentation. I think now it's time to open the panel discussion. So I will introduce you the 5 different panelists that we have today, and I would like to invite the panelists to turn on their video as they are introduced, actually. So I begin with Mr. Philip Rodbell. Mr. Philip Rodbell is Deputy Director for Forest and Equity at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, where he supports President Joe Biden's executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, and on addressing environmental justice and the minority and low-income population. Our second panelist is Dr. Eugenia Sebutnikova. Dr. Eugenia Sebutnikova is Deputy Head of the Department of Natural Resources Management and Environmental Protection of the City of Moscow and South Sherport of Moscow U20 cities. She conducts environmental monitoring issues in Moscow, including monitoring of green spaces, research activities, and issues in Moscow's climate and environmental policy. Our third speaker is Mr. Simon Needle on behalf of the councillor Wasim Zafar, who had to cancel his participation due to a personal emergency. Simon Needle is a principal arboriculturist and principal ecologist in the Birmingham City Council. Birmingham City Council is the largest single local authority in Europe and the second largest city in the UK. Mr. Needle is responsible for every issue concerning urban forestry in Birmingham City and supported Councillor Wasim Zafar by his present preparation for the meeting. Then we have Professor Alan Simpson. He is a landscape architect, an urban forester, and urban designer, and is Professor Emeritus of Landscape Architecture and Urban Forestry at Leeds Beckett University in the UK, where he is involved in teaching, research, and innovative practice. He is a member of the steering committee of the European Forum on Urban Forestry and led the EU collaboration on science and technology cost action on behalf of the UK. He is also chair at the White Rose Community Forest and a board member of both Arboricultural Association and the Community Forest Trust. And our last expert is Mrs. Helen Ding. She is a senior environmental economist and head of the Circular Economy Knowledge Hub at the World Resource Institute. Her work primarily focused on terrestrial ecosystem and involved the development of economic models to measure and demonstrate the socio-economic value of natural resources and better governmental and business decision-making. Helen supports projects globally, including with the WRI China office. So a warm welcome to these 5 panelists. And I would like now to open the first round of the panel discussion. We will have 2 or 3 rounds, depending if you have time. The panel will begin with a question to each panelist. I would like to remind participants to share the question in the chat. Then they will be considered during the question and answer session at the end of the meeting. So 1 question per panelist. You have 3 to 4 minutes to enter the question. And I will begin with Mr. Philip Rothbell, Deputy Director for Forest and Equity at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. So, Mr. Rothbell, the US has done a lot of work building up a national support program for urban and peri-urban forestry. In your opinion, what have been the key success factors of the program? What can other countries learn from this?
Thank you, Clémence, and very honored to be here. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., so good morning. The current federal program in urban forestry was established as a budget line item in the United States Department of Agriculture Forest Service in 1990. After 10 years of concerted advocacy and public education, focused on the federal role in protecting public health and safety. In my opinion, that was key to the program's establishment and growth to today's $40 million annual program, delivered in partnership with state forestry agencies. Today, President Joe Biden's Build Back Better agenda now has the program proposed at $2.5 billion over the next 10 years because of its climate benefits in reducing extreme heat, which is the leading weather-related cause of death in American cities, especially impacting vulnerable communities. Research findings are largely accepted that trees are a nature-based solution to reducing many threats facing cities, including heat, flooding, air quality, and decline in public mental and physical health. I believe that this success of the US program can be replicated in all countries by building a strong constituency of local government and non-governmental organizations in every state, region, and territory. President George Bush Sr. called them 1,000 points of light back in 1990 when he signed the legislation creating the urban forestry program. In our case, the non-governmental organization American Forests was funded by the Forest Service for 10 years in 1980 to develop this program of advocacy and education based on Forest Service research showing the climate benefits of trees and the simple finding that 4 trees were dying in cities for every 1 planted. Cities need federal assistance to reverse this trend. American Forests and other federal partners like the Trust for Public Land cultivated both conservative and progressive champions in the United States Congress who held hearings to validate this research as fact in cities across America. They published a magazine called Urban Forests that had more than 30,000 readers each month when the legislation was passed in 1990. The program's success can be attributed to its broad authorities and flexibility in meeting local needs for community engagement, planning green space interventions, and planting, maintenance, and protection of trees and forests, as well as developing freely available technology like iTree Eco and mapping services that have shown that the absence of trees in vulnerable neighborhoods and communities of color across the country is a significant concern. So in summary, success in the United States was achieved through strong research findings, constituent education and engagement around simple messages, broad political support for a national role, and funding made accessible through every state and every community. Today, more than 200 million residents in the United States benefit from this federal program. And I believe this can be replicated in every country through concerted efforts of advocacy and public education over time. Thank you, Clémence.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for this very positive message from the US that we hope to replicate, of course. The next question is for Mr. Simon Needle from City of Birmingham. Mr. Needle, the City of Birmingham has just conducted an extensive update of your Master Urban Forestry Plan. The policy brief calls for more national level support for sustainable urban and peri-urban forestry in the form of policy, guidelines, funding. Do you see a need for this from your own local perspective? Where would national support be more helpful?
Thank you, Clémence. Yeah, and Councillor Zafar gives his apologies for not being able to make today. So yeah, hopefully I can fill in for him. Yeah, I think we've with a little bit of context with where we are in Birmingham. We've had a number of local tree policies that we were implementing, but they were often a bit disparate. They were not joined up across our directorate. So we've gone through this process of drawing forward now our urban forest master plan, which has brought together that strategic level coordination across the city. But yeah, looking at in going through this process, we did do a review of national policy as well as local policy. And there's areas where I think we could see that there could be better strengthening of national policy that would help us implement this master plan better. Our government has over the last few years put a lot of emphasis on large-scale tree plantings. We've got targets of 30,000 hectares of woodland creation being set per year. But these policies are focusing very much on the rural parts of the UK and England, and so therefore they're putting trees outside of cities where the majority of our populations are living. So that focus of bringing trees into the urban environment wasn't necessarily there. And obviously, as we all know, with populations expected to grow in cities by 2050 to much higher levels than we see today, we need to be bringing those trees into that air, into the cities. There has been, though, a bit more development around national policy. And I think this is where we're starting to see this link in with what we want to do. So we've had the Lawton report, which was Making Space for Nature, which was back in 2010 now, so a few years back. But that talked about biodiversity loss, but also the disconnect occurring between people and nature. And so it started to set about a framework of these local nature recovery networks, which is looking at how biodiversity and people are integrating within these urban areas. And I think that's starting to support bringing more trees into these urban environments. We can use those networks to improve connectivity and create these spaces, as Cecil was saying, having this 300, not more than 300 meters to open space. Moving on from that, the local environment plan is talking about leaving the environment in a better state than we found it. And that obviously includes pledges to tackle climate resilience and air pollution. So we can see that although these things aren't necessarily naming trees specifically in the documents, they are starting to come in through that process. But I suppose more recently, nationally, we've had the National Planning Policy Framework revisions, which has put more emphasis on providing new streets which as tree lined. So we're bringing that in, but these things are a lot of these things tend to be guidance documents, and I think actually having something that makes a mandate for some of this is going to be critical if we're able to deliver these effectively. But I think one of the things that we've been lacking, I mean, we've just mentioned there in the question about that policy. So we've got policy coming through saying, yes, we need to be doing all of these. We need to be bringing trees into the local environment for all the multiple benefits that we've seen. But we're seeing funding being perhaps restricted to just delivering new trees. And as Cecil was saying again, it's that long-term sustainable management that I think we're losing on. Local authorities here have seen quite significant reductions in central funding for their budgets, and so the first things that have been started to be cut have been some of the green space management side of things. So we've lost funding for that longer term management, which has reduced the acceptance by some people for putting new trees into the urban environment if they haven't got that funding. But we are now we're sort of starting to move forward. We're seeing more emphasis being put on using public money for public goods. So the revision of the Common Agricultural Policy and our UK's agricultural incentives that we've got, we're seeing a move towards a new environmental land management scheme, which hopefully will be allowing people to deliver, delivering public money. It's public money for public goods. So as a local authority that's quite a large landowner that has a lot of green infrastructure delivering public goods from those, I think that's going to be an opportunity for us to work into there. So I think so there's definitely needs to be an emphasis from national policy on getting trees into urban areas, but we also need that guidance, I think, on bringing that funding with it or delivering in that funding too.
Thank you very much, Simon, for this nice explanation of the role of national policy and funding for urban forestry. I would like to go to the third question to Mrs. Eugenia Sembitnikova, Natural Resources Management and Environmental Protection in the city of Moscow. So, Mrs. Sembitnikova, in Moscow, how have legislation and policy helped with the protection and development of urban and peri-urban forests?
Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Я еще раз...
Good day to you, colleagues. Once again, I would like to thank you for inviting Moscow to participate in these discussions on forming efficient policies to develop our urban environment and preservation of forests. In Moscow, there is a state program, 14 state programs for different economic sectors, and in the framework of the health program, there are special provisions devoted to the environmental protection and also actions aimed at preservation of the green spaces within Moscow. And also we're speaking about natural nature areas, and now we're looking into reconsidering the green islands within Moscow as they are very effective in combating climate change and pollution. So I spoke the last time and I gave a very big presentation last time, but I would like to remind you about what the green economy of Moscow is today. It's 250,000 square kilometers. 100 square kilometers is the area of Moscow up till 2012. I'm sorry, the sound is very difficult from the speaker. And up till 2012, we're speaking about the most urbanized part of Moscow, center of Moscow, which now expanded, and more than half of that area is covered with green greenery, and it could be divided into two parts, and we have developed a separate policy for each of them. First of all, it's the sort of the pearl of Moscow, as we call it. It's the preserved non-urbanized nature, and 19,500 hectares cover huge, massive areas covered with forest, untouched by the urbanization. And our first goal is to preserve this nature, and it is being preserved now. And we're speaking about more than 500 types of plants that are protected in our countries, and also animals, but it's positioned like enclaves among our urbanized districts, and this creates the urbanistic context. This is what was mentioned by one of the previous speakers, and we are speaking about to what extent we can afford recreational activities in some parts of these territories. And this is a very topical issue, and it's a hot issue, because these spaces are visited frequently by our people, by Muscovites, and we have a special law of the city of Moscow that prohibits decreasing the area covered by greenery, and there are some natural reserves that are being protected by special legislation, and they may not be visited either. But also we should speak about what type of recreational development would be possible, is acceptable, so that we could prevent the deterioration of the quality of this area. We also have some areas. The second part of this greenery in Moscow is the areas where we have city parks, or where where inhabitants planted trees, and they have a different purpose. And Moscow currently has a regulatory basis that determines how these areas can be used. And once again, it's engraved in our law that we may not decrease the total area covered by forests, trees, but at the same time we're dealing with the projects that allow wood felling in Moscow, but there is a law that instead of each fallen tree, either 1 or 2 trees should be planted, depending on where it happens. And this provision is supported by several projects, greening projects. One of them is devoted to greening courtyards in micro-districts, which is being implemented very actively, and the process is organized in such a way that inhabitants select what types of trees should be planted, where they should be planted, and also we are focused on greening new districts of Moscow, also the planting trees along roads and motorways. So, and the scale of this second part of forestry management in Moscow, which started less than 10 years ago, we created more than, in these last 10 years, we created more than 14 new parks. And 4,700 hectares, this is the area covered, that used to be covered by parks, but then they were repurposed and new trees were planted, and this created new recreation areas. But a certain very strict forestry regime is applied to these green spaces. Also, we are working on monitoring and accounting for these green spaces. This is also regulated by law. We have an independent expert monitoring of green spaces when representatives of different scientific organizations working in the field of dendrology, forestry, etc., are checking the health of the trees planted there. And I would also like to mention the most topical issues that we are facing currently, and what's of most interest to us is the issues pertaining to designing new green spaces that would create new optimal microclimate in those areas. For example, something to damp extreme high temperatures or low temperatures. The second vector of our activities is looking into possibilities of managing the forestry, urban forestry, using AI. And actually, in fact, I concluded my speech because I think I described more or less 3 vectors along which we are acting, and this is goal number 1 for our city. Thank you.
It's nice insight in the Moscow reality. Very nice. I come now to Mr. Alan Simpson, Professor of Landscape Architecture and Urban Forestry. So, Alan, you work with the European Forum on Urban Forestry. Sustainable urban and peri-urban forestry is still an emerging field, and we need to shift some focus away from just tree planting to sustainable long-term management of tree. So what can international organization and network do to support this effort? Can you give an example of your organization's effort in this direction?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for that introduction. I trust you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can.
Yep, that is good. That is good. Right, thank you. Well, trees have been planted in many towns and cities in Europe since the 14th century, if not before, mainly in the well-to-do parts of those cities. And this continued for many years, but tree planting greatly increased in the 18th and 19th century when the effects of the Industrial Revolution began to detrimentally affect the quality of life in so many cities. Many initiatives began to develop at that time, especially as towns and cities began to expand significantly, and this expansion continued after the end of World War I. Trees featured in the development of many cities across Europe, especially street trees, but it was not deemed to be urban forestry. At best, it was arboriculture, I suppose. Concept of urban forestry, as folks will know, originated in North America in the 1960s and 70s in an attempt to bring various professions together so that a more integrative approach could be taken to the tree-based part of urban green infrastructure. Europe was initially a bit reluctant to either accept the American approach or to develop its own version of urban forestry, although the concept was beginning to make significant headway, I think, in Europe. In the UK, for example, we had a couple of urban forestry conferences held in the 1980s. The first community forests were established, and even a charity called the National Urban Forestry Unit was created in 1995. Although there was not an agreed definition of what constituted urban forestry, Europe began to recognize that there was a need for a strategic, integrative, transdisciplinary approach to urban green space planning and management. At the time, research into urban trees and forest was taking place, but it was deemed to be a bit fragmented and uncoordinated, and thus 2 key events took place. probably should have moved on the slide by now, perhaps. Yep, that'll do for the moment. Thank you. The first one was the EU set up Cost Action E12 Urban Forests and Trees in 1997. COST stands for Cooperation in the Field of Scientific and Technical Research, and E12 attracted over 180 researchers from 34 countries from around the world. At the time, it was the largest cost action that existed, although there have been bigger ones since. But I think it was one of the most successful, as the research networks that were established back then still exists. And it also still stimulates an amazing amount of outputs from Europe regarding urban forestry, and not only in research, but also in terms of policy development, and more of that in a moment. Right, next slide, please. Thank you. The second key event was the creation in 1998 of the European Forum on Urban Forestry. The Urban Forum was of the view that the key to successful urban forestry innovation and future potential lay in the adoption of a transdisciplinary approach. Urban forestry encompassed the professional remit of many design, technical and managerial disciplines, and to be successful had to understand and accommodate the human, the natural and the economic processes of the cultures within which they were working. Increasingly, this also had to include all aspects and levels of the community in the decision-making processes associated with the planning, design, implementation, and subsequent management of the urban forest. Thus, the European Forum is a unique meeting place for practitioners, for policymakers, managers, academics, scientists, students who are active and engaged in urban forestry, urban greening, and green infrastructure. And it had a profound influence, I would argue, on the development of the concept of urban forestry across both Europe and internationally. Next slide, please. Thank you. Since its inception in '98, we have met annually to discuss new developments, to exchange experiences, and to visit good examples of good practice in the planning, design, implementation and management of urban forest, wherever they may be found. And as you can see from this list, and the next slide, please, the amazing places that we have met. Hopefully next year we'll be actually physically meeting in Belgrade. We didn't manage to meet in Manchester this year because of COVID, but it was replaced by webinars, which actually were very successful. So next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah. So the forum that we had recently attracted delegates from all over the world. The forums associated with IUFRO, the FAO, the European Forest Institute, and several other organizations that are concerned with urban forestry and urban greening. And we are in the process of investigating really incorporation of the forum. The work of the forum now is...
Alan, are you also coming to the conclusion?
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Yes, I'll move on. Quick. Next slide, please. The work is well recognized worldwide now, and many of us are involved in the FAO's very successful international meetings, which you can see here. It was very significant, for example, for the FAO to hold the first African meeting of urban forestry this year, and to see the amazing work that is going on there. What has emerged from the work of the forum is that urban forestry is not just about trees and woodland, nor is it about people, as has often been suggested, although the melding of both is, of course, very important. Urban forestry has emerged as a philosophical approach to having an overview of the planning, design, implementation and management of the whole mosaic of a town, a city, or even a region's urban and peri-urban green space, and all the implications that has to engaging with the associated social, economic and environmental issues and strategies. The forum agreed that urban forestry is a big idea, a big concept, and now that it is established across Europe and internationally, partially due to the work of the forum, it can embrace the huge changes that are in train for all of us. Just as a few examples, and very quickly, we've heard about Birmingham today. The UK government is actually encouraging towns and regions to do the same. We have a northern forest which has been established across the whole of the northern part of the UK, and part of that are the White Rose Forest, which I am part of very much. All the local authorities involved are currently producing urban forestry strategies, all funded by the government. We have an Environment Act, which was actually came law on the 9th of November, only not so long ago. And under that, each scheme in future will have to produce a report that gives at least 10% of biodiversity net gain for each development, or else we're in trouble. So the link now between national policies and local action is there, and is a very important part, I think, of actually getting things done. Last slide, please. The key thing now is that trees are no longer a cosmetic to soften poor quality urban design. They are a metaphysic, a first principle of our viable urban futures, and collaboration is the name of the game. Thank you for your time, and apologies for going on for too long. As usual.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alan. It's terrible to have to cut the expert, actually. I think 4 minutes is not enough. But we will come to our last expert now, panelist, Mrs. Helen Ding, Senior Environmentalist Economist by WRI. Helen, you have worked extensively on sponge cities in China, including the critical role of urban forests and green spaces in providing multiple benefits to cities, such as flood prevention, for example. Yet often these benefits are not well understood or compared to alternative development approaches, or can require ambitious long-term commitments that are major challenging decisions. But despite these challenges, many cities in China are now making rapid progress to become sponge cities. So what are the key drivers of scaling up sponge cities in China? What lesson can be learned from China's experience?
Thank you, Clemens, for that question. I think before I dive into a sponge city example in China, I'd like to just highlight a couple of key facts on this slide that you can see. In China, since 2010, flooding damages has cost China up to 300 billion yuan, which is equivalent to about $46 billion US. As climate change intensifies, as we all know, these tangible costs will only increase in the future. So in response to those flooding risks and damages, China has developed the sponge city concept. Between 2015 to 2016, about 30 Chinese cities were selected for the sponge city pilots. As shown on the map, you can see many of the pilot cities are ranked highest in the GDP in the region, and also they're exposed to high flooding risks. So that's part of the reason why there's a very strong interest from local government perspective to adopt the sponge city concept. And more recently, in April 2021, another 20 cities were added to this pilot program. And if well implemented, I think China will scale up even more broadly to the whole country. So what is sponge city? Could we go next slide, please? Could we bring up next slide, please? Okay, thank you. So just to illustrate on this slide, a sponge city is a new urban construction model proposed by Chinese researchers in 2014. The concept originated from the Western concept of low impact development, which many of you are familiar with. And the major difference is basically that the sponge city concept uses nature infrastructure such as green roofs, retention tanks, wetlands, etc., to absorb stormwater, and can be applied to inland cities with abundant water resources. It's particularly useful for urban flooding management by strengthening ecological infrastructure and draining systems as well. Next slide, please. And here early this month, we just launched our new report looking at how to quantify the economic benefits of those infrastructures. And we selected Wuhan as a case study. Wuhan, as many of you know by now, is also one of the first 30 smart city pilots in China. Our research shows that smart city construction could help increase the total annual runoff control rate from below 70% to over 80%. It can effectively mitigate urban flooding risks and build urban resilience in the face of increased climate change impact. It can also generate many important co-benefits, as several previous speakers have already mentioned. For instance, green infrastructure can increase property value and improve stormwater recycling and sequester carbon, control air pollution, etc., etc. So there are many benefits. So in our study, where we found over a period of 30 years, smart city constructions can generate $2.5 billion US in net benefits. So in my opinion, China's experience has taught us three very important things for policy implementations. Number one, we need a very strong political will to make it happen. And in this case, China's top-down decision-making process helped to get the plan through at the very earliest place, where there's no demo projects showcase the benefits yet. And number two, we need a very strong science-based evidence to support decision-making. And the first round of pilots have been provided useful data and evidence to showcase the effectiveness of smart cities in managing stormwater, which then can be learned by other cities. And number three is to integrate measurement of ecosystem improvement into the evaluation of the performance of local government officials. The Chinese government has now required to integrate gross ecosystem products into their local government performance evaluation criteria. This can ensure the continuity of policy implementation during a change of local government. But in addition to this, there are also many issues remain to be resolved in the future. For example, our research revealed that the difficulty of estimating the additionality of natural-based solutions in stormwater management. When disasters happened and the existing urban infrastructure didn't work and didn't have the capacity to handle those disasters, citizens often blame the smart city constructions. For example, in recent severe flooding, as many of you might have heard in Zhengzhou this year, has actually triggered quite a hot debate within China over smart cities, whether it is effective. And that's something that research can be helpful to resolve the problem. And in response, we need to improve the data and also measurement to assess and showcase the effectiveness of those projects. In particular, it's extremely important to improve our understanding of future climate risks and also develop methods and standards that can help us to better measure the additionalities that are provided by nature-based solutions. And finally, my last point is on financing. As several panelists have already mentioned before, it is very important for scaling up these measures for the long term. And in particular, I think we really need to develop innovative financing mechanisms to leverage more private finance in addition to the public funding to support long-term sustainability of urban forest development. So with that, I will close here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helen. Very nice about inputs about economical thinking. I think we will go now directly to the Q&A actually. So I will thank you very much for your presentation to all the panelists. It was my pleasure to lead you through this panel's discussion. I will now welcome my colleague Keith Anderson for the moderation of the question and answer session with the panel and with Cecil. Keith, the floor is yours. Keith, do you hear?
So I think I'm on now. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much, Clémence. Just very briefly, colleagues, we have 20 minutes left for the question and answer session. And I think already bilaterally some questions have been asked as well as on the chat, which I've been monitoring. And so I would just say that I've been working in the international forest policy area since 2008, and before that for almost 20 years in developing countries. Not much in cities, mostly in tropical forests. And also I would add that, you know, I was in one of my previous visits to Rome, in the Museo di Roma, and I noticed that about more than 2,000 years ago, an emperor was touring Rome and the area around it, and noticed that it was much cooler where there were trees than in the high ceiling marble palaces where they were living. And so this was something that struck the emperor so much that he said, you know, we should start building our houses to live in these forest areas and around the perimeter of these forests around Rome, and that was how the first villas, the urban villas, were actually came to be 2,000 years ago in Rome. So I think it's an interesting place to be talking about urban forestry, and also about the reasons that they were choosing to live in those areas were not aesthetic; they were functional, as it's very hot and dry here. Also, it brings out some of the points that were raised earlier about the poor were living in those areas because the poor couldn't afford the marble palaces. So the poor were living there and they were moved out. So maybe things haven't changed all that much in 2,000 years, but I think we can change it, because I think the way we're talking about functionality of trees and urban forestry is a whole different take on this issue. So it's good to be in Rome, where I think we're ready to make the step towards more equitable urban forestry, much more technically savvy, approaching urban forestry from a much more science-based, as Ms. Ding mentioned, or from a regional approach, or from very well qualified infrastructure perspective. So without any further ado, I'd like to ask some questions to the panel. And particularly one jumped out at me on the chat, and that was maybe with respect to EFUF from Simon Borelli from FAO, talked about sort of scaling up and spreading urban forestry to Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And so how would some of the panelists react to that? How do we scale up now that the urban populations are growing, and now that there's a certain, after COVID also a certain, or during COVID, a certain momentum for trees, also because of climate change, the link with water. So I leave the floor open to panelists to answer the question of scaling up, how to bring urban forestry to scale. The floor is yours.
This is Phil Rodbell. I would say scaling up requires a focus on pilots, initiatives, and opportunities in cities where they are prepared and have capacity to implement. And I believe the FAO is tracking on that example. Communities at scale need support and technical assistance. And we have found in the United States, in fact, that technical assistance is far more valuable than dollars to help communities progress. Thank you.
Yeah, if I might add to that, Cecil here, this is an excellent point, I think, and there are some really good examples. One that comes to mind is Kampala in Uganda, where a few very passionate people managed to implement the very first urban forestry strategy and forest inventory, and now serve as a model throughout Africa. And I think to add to Phil's comment, I think education, capacity building is really part of that. So we have to train a generation of experts who can actually start implementing these ideas.
Yeah, can I add to that? I have been working with a guy in Nigeria who has actually, strangely enough, been doing a PhD in Lagos and one or two other cities about urban forestry. And initially, we suggested to him, don't take the European version. You've got to come up with your own version in that neck of the woods. And what staggered me, he's done various questionnaires, well over 1,200 responses from all sorts of people, from politicians down. And it really is amazing how human beings actually, wherever you find them, have very much the same really demand for a high quality of life. And it does mean design is different. There's no point having huge squares, for example, in places like Lagos. It gets so hot. Who on earth is actually going to be walking across a square when it's 40 degrees? But they all wanted trees. The spiritual value of trees actually outside their house was amazing. And once you start getting the conversations going, it was absolutely staggering how folks in places you think would be the last thing on their mind, bearing in mind everything else they've got to take, know that the idea of having trees and what have you was brilliant. So I think we can take it to other countries. I think we can. Obviously, there isn't a one size fits all, as we all know. But it's amazing how when you engage with human beings, we're not actually all that different, whatever culture or anything else that we may differ us. We are actually very much the same sort of folks. And urban forestry and trees actually does chime with so many folk. I'll shut up because I go on for far too long.
Can I come in next?
Please, Ms. Ding.
Yeah, as an environmental economist, I think I wanted to bring the importance of demonstrating, showcasing the economic benefits. And as many of our studies have shown, when you make a very clear message to the public audience and also policymakers that investing in urban forest is important for example, bringing health benefits, and that's very individual. And that is a really powerful message to educate people, to convince policymakers that is needed, and you wanted to invest in the future of the city and also the population living there. And then secondly, I think in addition to the bottom-up approach, I think top-down strong political will is also very important to enforce the regulations and policies at local level, so that we can have consistency and continuity of policy implementation over time. And the last is finance. So again, financing is really important, and I think many municipalities and local governments are struggling with budgets over the in the coming year, in particular after recovering from the COVID. I think it's really important to work together with financial institutions as well, to develop financing mechanisms that can also leverage private finance to engage with private investors and develop a program that is actually benefiting for all. I will stop there. Thanks.
I think if Ms. Ding raised an important point that I talked about scaling up maybe to a larger regional level, but maybe what are some of the ways that I noticed several comments in the chat of how does this work? What are some of the best practices in getting national governments, city governments, and actually participation of citizens? What are some good experiences you from your diverse backgrounds could mention about how those processes work to make the urban forestry link to the urgent needs of the citizens and the improved life quality? So how does it work internally, not just scaling across the globe, but also how does it work down to the local level, maybe from the bottom up?
Yeah, as Helen was suggesting, it is the partnerships are critical, and local leadership is paramount. The federal funds at the national level need to be made accessible, and often the management of those dollars are an obstacle to vulnerable groups, smaller organizations. And so you need to step it down with local partners. It could be the city itself to receive resources and then work closely with school districts, for example, in Chicago, planting trees in schoolyards that are not shaded. But the cities know best where to focus those dollars. If direction is on flooding or extreme heat reduction, localities can, with a little bit of direction, begin to focus resources where they're needed the most. But making those funds accessible, or the technical assistance, as I said, it could be a simple one-page request, because we do need something in writing. We need to get a sense of the capacity of a local group. I did want to make a point also about the word urban. Urban areas are ecosystems, and people are part of that. We often in urban forestry put urban in front of everything, but forests is something accessible. Rural residents recently relocated to cities think fondly of their forests, and the word community, bringing making those trees accessible, giving ownership to local residents to care and steward trees and forest, is a very winnable project. It's very easy for communities, if they're empowered, to take ownership of the tree in front of their home or down the street or the local forest. So community forests is a term that fits well in the urban context. If you will, all the definitions apply. But thank you.
Yeah, I just add a little thing. It was interesting in the city that I work in, the city of Leeds in the UK. People were very sympathetic to the idea of planting trees, but certainly the commercial folks sort of said, "Oh yes," they get in the way. And we made some progress by not using the word shade, because of course that covers up also, and called it shadow play. So, oh well, yeah, that's how. But the key thing that changed things was a government report into aerial pollution in city centres. And for Leeds, for example, they said that every year at least 340 people die from diseases caused by air pollution. And as soon as that was published, the Chamber of Commerce said, "What the hell are you going to do about this? Why will anyone invest in this city if they know that half of them are going to die, for goodness sake?" So we said, well, there are ways of doing this, that, and the other, but we have got to increase street trees. The canopy cover of the city is about 7%. It's got to be doubled as soon as possible. Right tree, not just blasting any old stuff anywhere. And the commercial people said, damn right, yes, get on with it. And money did become available. Yes, we had to change some of the roads and close some roads. It's still going on, because you're nice to wave a Harry Potter wand and change it all overnight, but you can't. It actually takes some while to do it. But it was that persuaded the commercial folks that actually spending money on trees to reduce aerial pollution, and we have sensors and all sorts of things to prove it. Got to have some conifers, for example, because you need leaves in winter and all the rest of it. And it got the support of the commercial folks really pretty well straight away. Yes, you had to do a few presentations and prove it, but we can do that. The other interesting thing is people talk about community consultation. We sort of say that's a little bit of a top-down thing, really, and it's easy. We've communicated with them, now we can get on and do what we were going to do anyway. It's really community engagement, and it's engaging with communities, and it takes time. And sometimes when you just turn up and you say, oh, I'm an architect, whatever, and say, oh, push off, really don't know. But we've used artists quite a few times, because an artist goes in and says, oh, poor sod, come in, sit down, have a drink. And if it's the right sort of artist, within a few months, you're talking about trees, you're talking about planting, and yeah, it takes time, but you actually break down those barriers that some communities have against professionals, if you like, who always just do what they want to do. And I'm sure different places do things differently, but it's quite interesting sometimes, just by giving people a report on X for communities doesn't always work. You actually have to do things much more subtly, but it does work. And it is quite fascinating how different communities actually do things differently. It is the poor communities who have very little green space, and it's just houses and roads. And we have had some success in actually, particularly in some of the poorer places, actually, because car ownership is so low, saying, okay, let's close this street. It's a dead end anyway. Let's have a little car park up the top there. And actually, let's dig it up and actually let's grass it and plant some trees. And you'd be amazed how often people say, oh, wow, yes. The place gets hammered during summer with barbecues and God knows what. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You've actually changed that community by a relatively simple thing of getting rid of the blacktop and actually putting grass and half a dozen trees in it. And trees that are different, some that blossom early in the year, some couple of evergreens and ones. So giving variety. And even the medics have said, actually, the number of folks that actually have gone to the doctors now over the last year has actually reduced quite significantly. We know this, but it is quite interesting to actually be out there and be able to prove it.
Yes, and the experience at the community level and also the science is the best way to instill fear into politicians. We use that a lot in forests and climate change in Switzerland as well, to move programs through Parliament. And so I'd like to give in the final 3-4 minutes that we have, unfortunately, I'd like to give a chance to Simon, Cecil, and Ms. Semutnikova, who haven't replied to the questions before, a chance to have some closing words. Please, any of you may take the mic.
Yeah, if I could just pick up on the last comments, really. I think we've had our urban forest master plan developed, and it was very important to us that was a co-created document. So it was actually led by one of our community groups, our group of tree wardens. And although we would like to have gone out and actually undertaken face-to-face consultation, because of the COVID pandemic, much of our consultation was online. But I think that actually did, in some respects, allow us to reach more people than we may have actually done on a physical basis. So that was quite a useful process, getting their priorities, getting their understanding about the urban forest. One of the things that has come out of that, though, is around looking at tree equity and how we can take that forward. So we're currently delivering or starting to create our tree equity platform, but we'll be able to target that down to our what we call lowest super output areas, which is our areas of about 650 households. So that will hopefully give us the opportunity to identify these areas much further in advance about and see what we can do. And as Alan was saying, it is the time it takes to engage these communities. We know that some of these areas are losing significant numbers of trees, and it's within the private areas, those household gardens, those private spaces. So we need to work with them to understand why they don't have this affinity with trees, find out what the importance is, whether it's that spiritual, cultural, aesthetic side that's going to be encourage them to have more trees there. And maybe it's that trees aren't the best option for them there. Actually, perhaps it's other green infrastructure. So yeah, having that time to sort of forward plan, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years, I think is going to be a good option coming out of this planning.
Excellent. And the last two have a chance to make also some closing comments, please. Don't be shy.
Okay, I'll jump in quickly, and then Evgenia has a chance to close the discussion. Go ahead. Go ahead, Evgenia. I'll follow you.
Thank you so much, Cecil. It's topical for me. The topic, the issue that was reflected upon by the participants, how to work with people and how to find expert solutions. And as I have already mentioned for Moscow, the main issue is to try and figure out what part of nature should not be touched when we see residential areas around, and what part could be offered for recreational activities, for sports, for promenades, and what sort of solutions would be acceptable. And it's true, people who came from regions rich in forests at this point in time don't yet feel the deficit of greenery, but those who were born in Moscow, lived in Moscow for several generations, to them real nature is one of the greatest values. And this is a conflicting story because it involves different people, different approaches, and it's very important to understand how to work with that. And Alan mentioned we had to make several presentations, or maybe to pick some new formats, or it's very important for us, maybe you already have some projects or examples of what you use to approach people and to persuade them, and what formats did you use in order to satisfy the needs of the people. And I very much like to ask Helen about it, because this project is a very ambitious project. This is I see in it revolutionary modernization of the territory, in spite of the advantages emphasized. These advantages are in the future, so you have to reach an agreement with people, because at this point in time they don't see any advantages yet, not yet. So I hope to hear just a couple of words from Helen about it, how you're planning to work with the people in the years to come. Thank you.
We're a bit over time, colleagues, but I can allow Cecil or Helen both to have very short interventions, please. And then I'm going to give it over to the Secretariat that also has some announcements for you and closing remarks. And I really urge, this has been a fascinating, absolutely fascinating panel to keep contact with each other and bilaterally, multilaterally on these issues. It's really been very, very exciting. So please.
Let me just take 10 seconds and then Helen can have the final word. So I think what we need is good governance. We need leadership. We need inspiration. We need to carve out a clear profile of what an urban forester is. And then with that, we have to attract talent, young people who want to work in this, because this is going to be a growing field. And I see a lot of young people coming in now that are super talented, and we have to give them a hopeful career track. So that'll be my kind of 10 cents, 2 cents.
Well, I would add to that then the way you just said that is good communication also. And the 330-300, I think, has inspired many people everywhere. So I would add communication to that list as well. Yeah. So, Helen, you have the last word.
I think we have to sell the idea that management is the tool by which design never ends.
Helen? You're muted.
I think I will just closing up by saying that as someone also mentioned in the chat, knowledge and best practices transfer at management level. So I think as a researcher, I wanted to do more research to demonstrate the benefits to people. And then what is more important, at least from my work in China, is that we need to improve our communication with local citizens to make them understand that there are benefits for them, not for only the city. And with that, I think I would just turn it back to the chairman. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, distinguished panel. And now I'll let the Secretariat close up the session. Back to you, Daniel.
Thanks very much, Keith, for an excellent discussion. Thanks to all of our panelists today and our speakers. Of course, a special thanks to Cecil. It's really a fantastic policy brief that a few of us have had a chance to see, and it will be coming soon. So I highly recommend it to others. And we really appreciate the discussion today, which can hopefully enrich the final version of that. Just before we close, I want to share very briefly some of our other work on sustainable urban and peri-urban forestry. You're welcome to join. We have an informal network of experts on sustainable urban forestry. I see some of our members here today. Special welcome to them. And if you are interested in participating in this is a space for peer exchange and dialogue. I think there's a lot of rich ideas that came out of our first meeting in October. Interest in collaboration, and where we're going to be having our next meeting probably in the second week of December. So please do let us know if you're interested in that, and we'd be happy to involve you. And of course, our Trees and Cities Challenge, this was launched in 2019 at the Secretary General's Climate Action Summit. We have a current call for pledges open for cities. This includes pledges for planting trees, but also improving management practices to grow them sustainably in the long term. So please visit the Trees and Cities website as well if that is of interest. So without further ado, I'd like to thank all of you for joining today. We have a packed schedule, a really interesting discussion. It would have been nice to have time for even more. But right now we actually have to wrap up as we have intergovernmental sessions starting briefly again. So thank you all very much. Special thanks to our moderators today, Clémence and Keith. Really appreciate your support for the project, the support of the Federal Office for the Environment, and the engaging discussion today. Thank you all very much and have a great afternoon or morning or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you.